The sun rose over the medieval abbey with a soft golden glow, casting long, solemn shadows across the stone walls. It was All Saints' Day, a day of reverence, of solemn prayer, and of remembrance for the departed souls of the faithful. Bells tolled slowly, their deep chimes echoing through the forested valleys surrounding the monastery, calling the monks to gather in the chapel for the Holy Mass. To any outsider, the day seemed peaceful, sacred, almost untouched by the darkness of the outside world. But beneath the veneer of holiness, the air was thick with tension, and in the quiet corridors, whispered conversations carried fear as much as devotion. This was not the serene sanctuary one might imagine. Monks, men bound by sacred vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty, lived under the ever-watchful eyes of the abbot. Yet within the cloistered walls of the abbey, isolation and discipline often gave rise to resentment. Human nature, even when cloaked in religious devotion, can twist in unexpected ways. Hunger gnawed at bellies, petty jealousies festered into grudges, and the relentless demands of monastic life became unbearable. This story, unlike the pious sermons preached from the pulpit, would reveal the shadowy depths of faith corrupted, of obedience betrayed. In the year in question, the abbey was home to a dozen or more monks, each a man of routine, habit, and ritual. Every day was dictated by prayer, labor, and reflection. But it was All Saints' Day, a day meant for solemn remembrance and communal gatherings, when something unspeakable occurred, something that would echo through history as one of the most chilling acts of sacrilege imaginable. On this holy day, the very men sworn to serve God would turn against their spiritual leader in the most horrifying way, by killing him and then consuming his flesh. The thought alone is almost incomprehensible, a grotesque inversion of the sacred rituals meant to honor the divine. Imagine the abbey in those early hours, the flickering of candlelight across the ancient stone, the smell of incense mingling with the damp chill of the morning. Monks moved silently, reciting prayers under their breath. Yet within this sacred space, malice had begun to brew. The abbot, a man both feared and respected, carried the weight of authority heavily. Some say his rule was harsh, others that he was capricious or even cruel, but regardless of his temperament, he had enemies in the cloister. Enemies whose patience had worn thin after years of whispered grievances, humiliations, and the quiet despair of being trapped in an institution where rebellion was unthinkable. Until that fateful day. The story that unfolds is one of extreme contrast. On one hand, the abbey represented devotion, tradition, and the spiritual aspiration of centuries. On the other, it became a theater of human darkness, where fear, anger, and perhaps desperation collided with ritual and reverence to produce an act so grotesque it defies moral comprehension. The clash between sacred ideals and human weakness sets the stage for what is to come. For historians and storytellers alike, it is a question that lingers like a shadow over the hallowed halls. How do men, dedicated to God, cross the threshold into barbarity? What drives pious individuals to commit an act that, in every age and every society, is considered unthinkable? And yet, this was not a story written in isolation. Medieval Europe was no stranger to violence, nor to the grotesque mingling of religion and human cruelty. Yet within the walls of this monastery, a place meant to cultivate purity of mind and spirit, the ultimate betrayal took place. The abbot, once a figure of authority and reverence, would become both victim and symbol, a dark emblem of the consequences when absolute power, isolation, and human frailty intersect. As the bells tolled again, marking the final hours before the morning mass, the monks moved through the shadowed corridors with purpose. What appeared to be the mundane rhythm of monastic life was, in fact, the tense prelude to a horrifying act. There would be no sermon that day, no comforting rituals to ease the faithful. Instead, there would be blood, betrayal, and an atrocity that would reverberate across centuries, leaving an indelible mark on history. This story is not just about murder. It is about the fragility of morality when pushed to its limits, about the darkness lurking behind devotion, and about the human capacity for horror when faith becomes twisted. As we delve into this grim tale, We must prepare to confront the unsettling reality that even those closest to God can commit acts that defy comprehension, that the most sacred spaces can harbor the deepest evils, and that history often hides horrors in the places we least expect them. All Saints' Day began as a day of light and remembrance, but by the end of that morning, the abbey would bear witness to a feast of death, one that would stain its stones and its legacy forever. Stepping into a medieval monastery was like entering a world suspended between heaven and earth, a place governed not by the chaos of the outside world, but by strict rules, devotion, and ritual. Life within these stone walls was regimented to an almost obsessive degree, a rhythm dictated by the ringing of bells rather than the sun. Each day was divided into hours of prayer, labor, study, and reflection, a sacred schedule intended to cultivate purity of mind and spirit. The monks, clothed in simple habits, moved silently along the cloisters, their steps measured, their faces serene. To outsiders, it was a vision of devotion, a haven of spiritual aspiration. Yet beneath this calm exterior lurked tension, envy, and resentment, hidden behind walls meant to shelter the soul from sin. The monastery itself was a self-contained universe. Stone chambers, dimly lit by flickering candles, echoed with the chanting of psalms. The dormitory was a place of Spartan simplicity, narrow wooden beds, straw mattresses, and a cold stone floor. Monks shared these quarters, sleeping side by side, their lives devoid of privacy. Every action, from rising before dawn to the act of washing hands before meals, was prescribed by the monastic rule. For many, the regimen brought comfort and structure, a path to spiritual enlightenment. But for some, it became suffocating, a relentless pressure that exposed every human weakness. Vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience formed the foundation of monastic life, yet they were not easy to uphold. Poverty meant that monks had little personal freedom or comfort. Every necessity, every possession was communal, shared among all members of the order. Chastity demanded the suppression of natural desires, a constant inner battle against the instincts that had defined them long before they entered the abbey. Obedience, perhaps the most demanding of all, required unquestioning loyalty to the abbot, whose word was law. Even a small act of defiance could carry severe consequences, a penance of hours of prayer, corporal punishment, or public humiliation before the brethren. This rigid structure was intended to purify the soul, yet it often created a simmering undercurrent of fear and resentment, a dangerous mix in a population confined to stone walls and limited social interaction. Work in the monastery was both physical and spiritual. Monks tended gardens, repaired buildings, copied manuscripts, and managed the abbey's resources. Each task was meant to be an offering to God, performed with mindfulness and devotion. Yet the work was grueling, often monotonous, and at times perilous. Sharp tools, heavy stones, and fire for cooking or heating were constant hazards. The isolation of the abbey compounded the stress, cutting off contact with the outside world and amplifying minor grievances into obsessions. A single insult, a perceived slight, or an unfair punishment could fester in the mind, twisting into anger that might one day find an outlet in unexpected and tragic ways. The abbot, the spiritual and administrative leader of the monastery, held immense power. He decided the daily routines, assigned tasks, mediated disputes, and maintained discipline. Some abbots were wise and compassionate, respected by all. Others were harsh, authoritarian, or cruel. In this particular abbey, the abbot was a man whose strictness and temperament left many of his monks feeling oppressed. Every command, every critique, became a weight on the conscience of those bound to obey. Yet questioning the abbot was not an option. Obedience was more than a rule, it was a sacred principle. Defiance was not merely rebellion, it was sin. This delicate balance between authority and obedience created fertile ground for resentment, secrecy, and, ultimately, violence. Food, too, played a subtle role in this tense ecosystem. Meals were simple: bread, pottage, occasionally fish, but portions were small, especially during fasting periods or religious observances. Hunger was more than discomfort. It was a psychological strain, a gnawing reminder of the harshness of monastic life. Some scholars argue that malnutrition and deprivation could contribute to irrational behavior, heightening stress and fueling anger among those already oppressed by the rigidity of monastic rules. In a place where every moment was scheduled and every action monitored, even basic survival could become a source of conflict. Yet, despite these pressures, monasteries were meant to be sanctuaries, places where the human soul could ascend above worldly concerns. They were centers of learning, preserving ancient texts, copying manuscripts, and cultivating knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to time. They offered spiritual guidance to surrounding communities, provided refuge to the needy, and maintained rituals designed to bring humans closer to God. The contrast between this noble purpose and the underlying tension within the abbey sets the stage for tragedy. What should have been a haven of virtue became, in some cases, a crucible for the darkest extremes of human emotion. It is in this world of contrasts, devotion versus resentment, austerity versus deprivation, obedience versus rebellion, that the story of the Feast of Death begins to unfold. The very rules designed to prevent sin also created the conditions in which violence could erupt. Monks, isolated from society and confined within stone walls, found their grievances growing in silence, their fears festering into something darker. It is a paradox of monastic life. In striving to elevate the spirit, the abbey could simultaneously crush the human soul. Understanding this environment is crucial. Without it, the actions that follow, murder, betrayal, and cannibalism, might seem incomprehensible. But placed against the backdrop of extreme isolation, strict hierarchy, constant surveillance, and physical deprivation, the events that would unfold on All Saints' Day begin to take on a terrifying clarity. Here, in this self-contained world of stone, prayer, and discipline, men were pushed to the edge. It was a world where the sacred and the profane existed side by side, where holiness could coexist with horror, and where the human capacity for darkness could emerge in the most shocking and unthinkable ways. The abbey was meant to protect the soul, yet it became a crucible for sin. In the next section, we will explore how resentment and grievances festered within this carefully ordered world, slowly setting the stage for the horrifying betrayal that would shock history. The abbey, for all its solemnity and devotion, was a pressure cooker of unspoken frustrations. On the surface, the monks moved through their routines with quiet diligence, chanting psalms and performing rituals with the discipline expected of men of God. But beneath the cloisters, behind the thick stone walls and closed wooden doors, a storm of resentment and simmering anger brewed. Every act of obedience, every correction from the abbot, became a tiny spark, slowly igniting a powder keg of fury. The seeds of rebellion were sown not in a single day, but over years of humiliation, deprivation, and perceived injustice. The abbot himself was a man of contradictions. To outsiders, he was a figure of authority, wisdom, and spiritual guidance. But to his monks, he could be imperious, harsh, and relentless in his scrutiny. Mistakes were met with public reprimand, minor failures magnified into moral failings, and even small acts of individuality were suppressed. One monk who dared question a decision risked being shamed before the others, forced into long hours of penance, or given exhausting labor assignments that left him physically and emotionally drained. Over time, these small indignities accumulated, feeding a growing sense of bitterness and hopelessness. Among the monks, whispers became a language of their own. Behind closed doors, in shadowed corridors, and during the rare moments of solitude, conspiratorial murmurs began to circulate. "He favors Brother Thomas over the rest of us," one would say. "His punishments are too severe," another muttered under his breath. These were not idle complaints. They were the murmurs of men pushed to the limits of endurance, trapped in a world where escape was impossible. Each whisper, each quiet expression of dissent, was a brick in the foundation of a plan that would eventually erupt into violence. The psychological toll of monastic life cannot be overstated. Isolation and monotony warp perception. In a world dominated by ritual, the mind begins to overemphasize slights and grievances. Hunger, fatigue, and the suppression of natural impulses, all daily realities for the monks, created fertile ground for resentment to grow into hatred. What might have seemed minor to an outsider became, in their minds, intolerable offenses. The abbot's authority, absolute by definition, became a symbol not of spiritual guidance, but of oppression. Small acts of defiance, once unthinkable, began to emerge. Monks would hide portions of food, neglect minor duties, or exchange pointed glances during sermons. These acts, though subtle, reflected a growing dissatisfaction, a silent rebellion against the rigid hierarchy that governed their lives. And yet, even as resentment simmered, fear of punishment kept overt action in check. The monastery was a tightly controlled environment. The abbot's eyes were everywhere, his influence unchallenged. For most, the notion of outright rebellion was unimaginable. But imagination is often the first step toward action. There were also deeper, more personal grievances that contributed to the growing unrest. Some monks may have felt jealousy toward those favored by the abbot, while others bore the psychological scars of past punishments or perceived injustices. In this confined society, rivalries and grudges were amplified. Privacy was non-existent. Every interaction occurred under the scrutiny of peers or the abbot himself. Without an outlet for anger or frustration, resentment fermented, transforming ordinary displeasure into a dangerous obsession. Over time, the monks became trapped not only by stone walls, but by the emotional prison of their own hostility. Food and deprivation played a critical role as well. Monks' diets were sparse, and meals were often insufficient to sustain them through long hours of labor and prayer. Hunger can heighten irritability, distort judgment, and amplify feelings of resentment. Imagine days filled with fasting and labor, where the only relief comes in the form of meager portions shared among men already tense with fear and frustration. The human mind, already under pressure from strict obedience and relentless scrutiny, is particularly vulnerable to irrational thinking in such conditions. And so, what began as petty frustrations evolved into a shared sense of grievance, a communal recognition of oppression that would ultimately unify the conspirators. It is also essential to understand the moral and spiritual contradictions that fueled this unrest. Monks were supposed to devote themselves entirely to God, yet their lives were filled with suffering and punishment, often imposed by another man rather than divine will. The dissonance between the ideals they had been taught and the harsh reality of daily life created internal tension. Obedience to a flawed human authority conflicted with spiritual devotion. Some historians suggest that this kind of cognitive dissonance, the clash between faith and reality, can lead to radical actions when the mind seeks resolution. For these monks, the solution would prove horrifying. The tipping point came as grievances converged into a plan. The monks' resentment, long suppressed, had reached a fever pitch. In secret, they whispered among themselves, testing each other's loyalties, gauging whether rebellion was possible. Discussions likely began cautiously, hypotheticals, questions, idle what-ifs. But over time, the whispers hardened into intent. The imagined act of defiance transformed into a blueprint for murder, a plan that could never be undone once set in motion. What had begun as moral outrage and personal anger became a collective resolve to commit an act so shocking that it would haunt history. As the Day of All Saints approached, tension in the abbey was palpable. Monks went about their routines with a heightened awareness, small signs of nervousness hidden beneath composed exteriors. Eyes darted, hands shook slightly during prayer, and whispered conversations took on a clandestine, conspiratorial tone. Every interaction, every glance at the abbot, carried unspoken meaning. The stage was set for catastrophe, and the audience, both historical and modern, is left in a state of breathless anticipation. This section of the story demonstrates the delicate balance between human nature, authority, and environment. It is a vivid illustration of how isolation, strict hierarchy, and psychological pressure can distort morality, creating conditions where ordinary men contemplate extraordinary evil. The abbot, once untouchable, became a symbol of oppression, while the monks, once instruments of devotion, became instruments of vengeance. The human psyche, under strain and in an environment of rigid control, can twist in ways that defy comprehension, setting the stage for acts of unspeakable horror. By the end of this period of mounting tension, The abbey had transformed from a sanctuary into a crucible of human emotion. Hatred, fear, and desperation combined, priming the monks for the unthinkable act that would unfold on All Saints' Day. The betrayal, planned in whispers and fueled by years of grievance, would mark the dark climax of this tale, an event that turned piety into carnage, devotion into betrayal, and a sacred day into a day of unspeakable horror. All Saints' Day arrived with an air of solemn reverence, the abbey bathed in the soft golden light of early morning. The bells rang out across the stone courtyards, their sonorous tones echoing over gardens and cloisters. Pilgrims and local villagers may have assumed that inside the abbey, the monks were performing their sacred rituals, offering prayers and hymns to honor the saints. Yet inside, a darkness unlike anything ever imagined had settled, poised to shatter the holy calm. The conspirators, men who had devoted their lives to God, moved with quiet determination, hearts pounding, hands trembling, yet minds resolved. This day, meant to honor the sanctity of life and faith, would be stained with blood. The abbey, usually a sanctuary of discipline and reflection, had become a stage for something monstrous. Each monk involved in the conspiracy understood the enormity of their act. Murder was an unthinkable violation of the sacred, a sin so profound that it would echo into eternity. And yet, years of oppression, deprivation, and festering hatred had eroded every moral restraint. In whispered conversations, in furtive glances, and in the shared nods of complicity, the plan had been rehearsed in shadows. The abbot, unaware of the brewing betrayal, moved through his routines, offering blessings and guidance, perhaps sensing nothing of the danger lurking just steps away. The attack began quietly. In the solitude of a side chamber, the conspirators struck, seizing the abbot with a mixture of fear and resolve. The struggle was brutal, a terrifying collision of authority and rebellion. Medieval accounts, sparse though they are, suggest a combination of blunt force and edged weapons. The sacred space was violated in an instant, the sanctity of life obliterated by the hands of men who had once sworn loyalty. The sounds, muffled cries, the clash of metal, the echo of stone corridors, were concealed from the uninitiated, leaving only the faintest hint of horror behind closed doors. But the horror did not end with murder. In a grotesque inversion of the rituals meant to honor life and sanctity, the conspirators carried the abbot's body to the kitchen. Fire crackled in the hearth, and pots and knives, normally instruments of sustenance, became tools of a macabre preparation. The act of cooking the flesh was both practical and symbolic, an unholy feast that mirrored, yet perverted, the communion rituals they had once performed with reverence. Each movement was deliberate, each cut methodical, the mind struggling to reconcile devotion with monstrosity. The men were no longer merely criminals. They had become participants in an act of sacrilege so profound it defied moral comprehension. The psychological dimension of this act cannot be overstated. Consuming the flesh of another human being is one of the ultimate taboos, a boundary that defines civilization itself. Yet these men, conditioned by years of isolation, rigid hierarchy, and psychological strain, crossed it without hesitation. Some historians suggest that acts like this may stem from a combination of desperation, distorted religious symbolism, and a desire for ultimate dominance over a figure once feared and resented. In this case, the abbot was not just a man. He was a representation of the authority that had tormented them, a symbol of oppression that had long shadowed their lives. Consuming his flesh was, in their warped logic, an assertion of power, control, and revenge. Outside the kitchen, the rest of the abbey continued in oblivion. The other monks, whether complicit or unaware, carried on their duties, the bells continuing to ring in eerie contrast to the crime unfolding within the walls. The juxtaposition of normalcy and horror, sacred rituals interrupted by grotesque violence, creates a chilling atmosphere. The sacred and the profane exist side by side, a tension that heightens the terror of the narrative. It is this contrast between the sanctity of All Saints' Day and the violation of every moral and religious code that makes the event so shocking, so unforgettable in the annals of history. Details of the feast itself, though horrifying, are critical to understanding the depth of this atrocity. The abbot's flesh, once the source of authority and life, became sustenance for those who had once revered him. The men ate in secret, suppressing guilt, rationalizing the act through distorted religious justification, or succumbing to the psychological grip of desperation. The air, normally scented with incense and bread, was now heavy with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Every bite was both a literal and symbolic consummation of rebellion, a grotesque ritual that forever stained the abbey's walls with its dark legacy. The act also carried a performative element, a deliberate inversion of the sacred rituals they had long performed. The Eucharist, a central rite of the Church, celebrates the body and blood of Christ as a source of spiritual nourishment. Here, in a perverse shadow of that ritual, the monks consumed the body of their abbot, a human, a mortal leader, instead of a divine symbol. It is this deliberate inversion, the crossing of moral and spiritual boundaries, that elevates the crime from mere murder to a historical horror of extraordinary psychological and symbolic significance. As the day wore on, the psychological toll on the conspirators became apparent. Fear mingled with adrenaline, guilt intertwined with rationalization, and the enormity of the act settled like a shadow over their minds. They had committed the unthinkable, and yet there was no turning back. In this moment, the abbey was both scene of horror and witness to the limits of human morality. The clash between years of devotion and a single, terrible act revealed the fragility of ethical boundaries when human nature, desperation, and resentment collide. This is the apex of the story, the point where tension built over months and years bursts into violent reality. Every detail, every whispered grievance, every deprivation and humiliation had led to this moment of ultimate betrayal. The Feast of Death, as historians would come to call it, is not only a story of murder but a study in the human psyche, in how ordinary men can become capable of extraordinary evil when pushed by circumstance, psychology, and ideology. It forces us to confront questions that transcend time. How thin is the line between devotion and fanaticism, obedience and submission, loyalty and moral corruption? By evening, the abbey had been irrevocably changed. Stones that had once echoed prayers now held silence and shadow. Rituals that had celebrated sanctity had been desecrated in the most intimate and horrifying manner imaginable. The Feast of Death was complete, leaving a stain on history that would be whispered about for centuries. Those who survived the act, whether complicit or not, were forever altered by the experience. Men who had crossed the ultimate moral boundary and, in doing so, became both perpetrators and victims of their own desperation and rage. This section of the story represents the horrifying culmination of all preceding tensions: isolation, resentment, oppression, and psychological strain. The acts committed on that fateful All Saints' Day stand as a testament to the extremes of human behavior, a moment when devotion turned to monstrosity, and a holy day was forever stained with blood. It is a story that shocks the conscience, fascinates the mind, and haunts the imagination, a dark reflection of what can happen when the fragile boundaries of morality and humanity are shattered. The morning after All Saints' Day dawned over the abbey with a silence that was heavier than any bell toll. The corridors that had once echoed with prayer were now burdened with the unspoken weight of horror. The Feast of Death had left an indelible mark on the walls, on the minds of those present, and on the legacy of the monastery itself. The act was not just a crime against a man. It was a violation of everything sacred, a betrayal so profound that it threatened to unravel the very foundations of faith and order within the abbey. Word of the atrocity, when it inevitably reached the outside world, would shock even the most hardened observers. The immediate aftermath within the abbey was one of tense uncertainty. The surviving monks, whether complicit in the act or not, were caught between fear and guilt. Some feared exposure. Others wrestled with the realization that they had been party to an unspeakable act. Confessions may have been whispered in private, tears shed in silent repentance, yet the knowledge of what had transpired created an atmosphere of psychological torment. The abbey, once a place of routine and sanctity, had become a prison of fear, where every glance could reveal suspicion and every word might betray complicity. Outside the monastery, News traveled slowly but with inevitable impact. Local villagers and neighboring clergy were horrified as rumors and fragmented reports of the event circulated. The story of monks killing and consuming their abbot was almost too monstrous to believe, yet the fear and fascination it generated ensured that it could not be ignored. Letters may have been sent to ecclesiastical authorities, messengers dispatched to report the incident to higher-ranking clergy, and inquisitors likely began to piece together the facts from the frightened testimonies of those present. The scandal threatened not only the reputation of the abbey, but the broader perception of monastic life and spiritual authority in the region. The Church, tasked with maintaining moral and doctrinal order, faced a dilemma. On the one hand, this was an extreme case of sacrilege and murder that demanded justice. On the other, it was a crisis that exposed vulnerability within a revered institution. Investigations were launched, likely involving interviews with surviving monks, scrutiny of the abbey's records, and examination of the evidence left behind in the desecrated chambers and kitchens. In a world where sin and crime were seen as reflections of both moral and spiritual failure, the act was a profound shock to the conscience of church authorities. The abbot, a figure whose authority had been violently usurped, became a symbol of the violation of sacred law, and the monks who had participated in his murder were confronted not only with legal consequences, but with eternal spiritual condemnation. Punishments, when meted out, were severe. Historical accounts suggest that those responsible were either executed or confined to harsh penance, often in isolation. In some cases, monks were publicly shamed or subjected to rituals meant to cleanse them of sin, acts designed to restore both spiritual and social order. The severity of these punishments reflected both the magnitude of the crime and the Church's urgent need to assert its authority. By punishing the perpetrators decisively, the Church sought to reassure the faithful that such grotesque acts would not go unpunished, that divine and human justice would prevail even within the cloistered walls of sanctity. Yet punishment alone could not erase the horror. The event left a psychological scar on the surviving community. Monks who had not participated in the act struggled with guilt, fear, and the knowledge that the sanctity of their home had been irreparably violated. Every sacred ritual thereafter would carry a shadow of memory, every meal a reminder of what had transpired in the kitchen that fateful morning. The abbey's reputation, once a symbol of piety and devotion, was permanently tarnished. Pilgrims, travelers, and even neighboring monastic communities viewed it with suspicion, awe, and horror. The Feast of Death became a story whispered in fear, a cautionary tale of what happens when human nature collides with extreme circumstance, authority, and deprivation. This scandal also offered a window into the broader societal context of medieval Europe. Monasteries were not isolated moral utopias. They were human institutions, subject to human weakness, ambition, and cruelty. While the monks' actions were extreme, they reflected the potential for corruption, resentment, and moral collapse inherent in hierarchical and confined systems. The story served as a grim reminder that no institution, however sacred, was immune to the darker impulses of those within it. It challenged contemporary observers to reconsider the nature of obedience, authority, and morality, questions that would resonate long after the abbey's walls had absorbed the echoes of that terrible day. The psychological consequences extended beyond the abbey walls. Clergy, scholars, and chroniclers debated the implications of such behavior. Was this an isolated act of madness, or did it reveal a deeper vulnerability within religious orders? Some may have attempted to rationalize it, suggesting famine, isolation, or extreme deprivation as mitigating factors. Others interpreted it as evidence of moral decay, a warning that even the most sacred institutions could harbor evil. These debates shaped the historical narrative, ensuring that the story of the Feast of Death endured as both a historical event and a moral parable. Even centuries later, the scandal continues to provoke fascination. Historians, true crime enthusiasts, and students of human psychology are drawn to the story not only for its shock value, but for what it reveals about the fragility of morality, the complexity of obedience, and the dark potential of human nature. The abbey, once a site of devotion, became an enduring symbol of the collision between sacred ideals and human frailty. The echoes of that day, when men turned against their spiritual leader and committed acts of unspeakable horror, continue to haunt the imagination, reminding us that history is often darker than fiction. In examining the aftermath, we see a story of both consequence and reflection. The Feast of Death was punished, condemned, and memorialized, but it also became a lens through which we can understand the pressures of medieval monastic life, the physical, psychological, and spiritual strains that can warp human behavior. It shows how absolute authority, extreme isolation, and deprivation can cultivate resentment to a breaking point, where ordinary men become capable of extraordinary evil. And it underscores the fragility of moral boundaries, a theme that resonates as powerfully today as it did in the shadowed corridors of that medieval abbey. Ultimately, the aftermath is not just about punishment or scandal. It is about the enduring moral and historical lesson. The abbey survived as a physical structure, but its moral and spiritual fabric had been irrevocably altered. The story left behind is a cautionary tale of human nature pushed to extremes, a narrative of horror, grief, and reflection that continues to captivate and unsettle those who encounter it. The Feast of Death stands as a testament to the consequences of unchecked resentment, oppression, and moral corruption, a story where judgment, horror, and scandal intersected in a way that history has never forgotten. The horrifying events of All Saints' Day did not merely shock medieval society. They opened a window into the complex and often disturbing workings of the human mind. To the modern observer, the notion that monks, men sworn to a life of piety, self-denial, and obedience, could murder and consume their abbot is almost incomprehensible. Yet, when viewed through the lenses of psychology, social pressure, and symbolic meaning, the motivations and the acts themselves begin to reveal patterns that, while horrifying, offer insight into human behavior under extreme conditions. Isolation is one of the most profound psychological pressures a person can experience. Monks lived for years within stone walls, cut off from the broader society, interacting only with a small circle of peers and a single authority figure. Such isolation can distort perception, amplify grievances, and erode the capacity for empathy. In the abbey, every slight, real or imagined, was magnified. Punishments, hunger, and the constant scrutiny of the abbot created an environment where resentment could fester unchecked. Psychological research has repeatedly shown that extreme isolation, when combined with rigid authority, can warp moral reasoning and weaken the inhibitions that normally prevent violence. In this light, the monks' actions, while morally abhorrent, were the predictable outcome of sustained psychological pressure. Hunger and deprivation likely played a critical role as well. Medieval monasteries were austere environments, and scarcity of food, particularly during fasting periods, imposed physical stress on the mind. Hunger can increase irritability, reduce impulse control, and even trigger cognitive distortions, where normal social and moral boundaries become blurred. The deprivation experienced by these monks was not occasional. It was systemic, part of a life built around sacrifice and discipline. When combined with years of fear, obedience, and resentment, it created a psychological tinderbox, primed to ignite in the most shocking ways. Symbolism adds another layer of understanding to this act of horror. The Feast of Death was not merely murder. It was a grotesque ritual, an inversion of sacred religious practices. The abbot, as the spiritual and administrative authority of the abbey, represented both divine order and human control. By killing and consuming him, the monks enacted a perverse assertion of power, reversing the hierarchy that had dominated their lives. In a twisted way, the act mirrored communion, the most sacred ritual of the Church, in which the faithful consumed the body of Christ to achieve spiritual unity. Here, however, the body consumed was not divine but human, a mortal leader, and the unity achieved was one of rebellion, not devotion. This inversion is both symbolic and psychological, a way to transform years of subjugation and resentment into a tangible, horrifying assertion of control. The act also highlights the human capacity for moral rationalization. The monks, having spent years internalizing obedience and piety, may have constructed elaborate justifications for their behavior. Perhaps they told themselves they were delivering justice, asserting freedom, or enacting divine will in a distorted form. Psychological studies show that humans are remarkably adept at rationalizing actions that violate moral norms, particularly when they feel oppressed or wronged. The combination of isolation, authority, and deprivation creates a mental environment where atrocity can be reframed as necessity or even virtue. Historical parallels provide additional context. Across time, societies have witnessed acts of violence committed by those within religious or communal institutions. Cults, for example, often display similar dynamics: extreme obedience to a leader, isolation from broader society, deprivation or control, and a radical shift in moral boundaries. While not identical, the monastery shares structural similarities with these environments: rigid hierarchy, psychological pressure, and social isolation. Understanding the feast of death in this context illuminates how ordinary individuals, when subjected to extreme structural and psychological pressures, can commit acts that seem unimaginable in ordinary life. This story also forces us to confront the interplay of fear, devotion, and morality. For the monks, devotion had become a double-edged sword. Their faith demanded obedience, yet their obedience had been twisted into oppression. The tension between spiritual ideals and lived experience created cognitive dissonance, a psychological phenomenon where conflicting beliefs or experiences generate intense mental discomfort. In an environment with no outlet for dissent or escape, the mind may resolve this dissonance in the most extreme ways, by eliminating the source of tension entirely. In this case, the abbot, both spiritual guide and oppressor, became the target. Cannibalism, one of the most taboo acts across cultures, adds an additional layer of symbolic horror. It represents the ultimate violation of natural and social law, a crossing of boundaries that separates humans from monsters. In consuming their abbot, the monks enacted a literal internalization of their rebellion. They took into themselves the authority they had once been subject to, turning a symbol of oppression into sustenance, control, and power. The act is both deeply symbolic and horrifyingly concrete, a reminder of how ritual, symbolism, and psychology can converge in the most unexpected ways. This story also raises broader questions about human nature. How far can resentment, deprivation, and psychological strain push ordinary individuals? At what point does obedience to authority become moral compromise? And when does repression of anger and frustration turn into active violence? The Feast of Death is a case study in the extreme, showing how the mind can adapt to justify even the most egregious actions when under duress. It forces us to examine the fragility of morality and the conditions under which ethical boundaries can be crossed, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. Finally, the psychological and symbolic dimensions of this story endure because they touch on universal themes: power, control, rebellion, and the tension between societal rules and personal grievance. The monks' actions, while extreme, resonate because they reveal a fundamental truth about human nature. When subjected to isolation, oppression, and sustained psychological strain, even those who are devoted, moral, and pious can commit acts that defy imagination. The Feast of Death becomes not only a historical event, but a lens through which to explore the darker recesses of the human psyche, a haunting reminder of the interplay between circumstance, belief, and morality. In understanding the psychological and symbolic layers of this tale, we gain insight into why such an atrocity could occur, why it shocked contemporaries, and why it continues to fascinate us today. It is a story that blends horror with reflection, violence with symbolism, and history with the timeless questions of human behavior. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between devotion and monstrosity, obedience and atrocity, is sometimes far thinner than we care to imagine. The abbey survived as a structure of stone and mortar, but its soul had been irrevocably scarred. The Feast of Death was more than a singular act of violence. It became a symbol, a dark stain on the legacy of monastic life. The story traveled beyond the cloistered walls, whispered in fear, fascination, and disbelief by those who would come after. Chroniclers wrote of the betrayal, moralists pondered its lessons, and historians debated its causes. The murder of the abbot and the cannibalistic feast carried a shock value that ensured the tale would never be forgotten. This event revealed the fragility of institutions that claim moral authority. Monasteries, often viewed as sanctuaries of learning, devotion, and piety, were exposed as arenas where human weakness, resentment, and cruelty could fester. The abbot, once an untouchable figure of divine guidance, had become a victim not only of personal grievance, but of systemic pressures and psychological strain. In a sense, the story challenges the idealized perception of monastic life, showing that even those dedicated to God are not immune to human corruption, jealousy, and rage. The legacy of the Feast of Death also lies in its psychological and symbolic resonance. Historians, psychologists, and storytellers alike have examined how isolation, deprivation, and rigid authority can distort morality. The story acts as a case study, a grim example of how circumstances can warp human behavior, turning men of faith into perpetrators of unspeakable horror. The symbolic inversion of sacred rituals, the consumption of the abbot's flesh, and the deliberate subversion of obedience serve as a stark reminder of the thin line between devotion and fanaticism, loyalty and rebellion, sanctity and savagery. In the centuries that followed, the abbey's story endured not only as historical fact, but also as a cautionary tale. Pilgrims and local villagers would speak of the events in hushed tones, a mixture of fear and awe coloring their retelling. Monastic authorities likely reinforced strict discipline, using the story as a deterrent, a moral lesson on the dangers of rebellion and the need for absolute adherence to authority. Yet the tale also inspired reflection, provoking questions about the nature of morality, justice, and human capacity for both devotion and evil. Even today, the Feast of Death captivates those who explore history's darkest corners. True crime enthusiasts, historians, and students of human psychology find in this story a perfect intersection of mystery, horror, and moral inquiry. It is a narrative that challenges our assumptions, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, and reminds us that history is rarely sanitized. The story lingers because it speaks to universal fears, betrayal by those we trust, the collapse of moral order, and the potential for darkness even in the most sacred places. Ultimately, the abbey stands as a monument to human complexity. Within its walls, men who once dedicated their lives to God succumbed to resentment, hunger, and psychological strain, committing acts that forever altered the course of its history. The Feast of Death is a reminder that human nature is fragile and multifaceted, capable of both extraordinary devotion and unspeakable evil. It teaches that morality is not automatic. It is cultivated, nurtured, and, in extreme circumstances, can unravel entirely. As we reflect on this grim chapter, we are left with questions that transcend time and place. How can devotion coexist with violence? How does authority, when misused, create conditions for atrocity? And what does it reveal about the human capacity to reconcile faith with horror, obedience with rebellion? These questions linger because the story itself is unresolved in a moral sense. It offers no easy answers, only the stark illustration of what occurs when circumstances, psychology, and human emotion collide in the most extreme ways. The Feast of Death is more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror held up to human nature, a lens through which we can explore the extremes of morality, obedience, and despair. The abbey may still stand in stone, but the story carved into its legacy endures as a warning, a fascination, and a haunting testament to the fragile boundary between piety and darkness. In the end, All Saints' Day, meant to celebrate sanctity and remembrance, became a day when the darkest impulses of the human soul were laid bare, and the world was reminded that even the most sacred places are not immune to horror.